She told me about the dinner the same way she'd mentioned picking up milk, somewhere between hanging up her coat and checking her phone. The whole family was coming to the house that Sunday. Her sister, her brother-in-law, the cousins from Barry, and of course her mother. A proper sit-down meal, she said. The good dishes. I asked if I should pick up anything from the LCBO. Maybe a bottle of red, something nice. She didn't look up from her phone. Actually, she said, it would be better if you stayed upstairs during dinner. I thought I'd misheard her. I was 63 years old, standing in the kitchen of a house I'd helped pay for since 1998, and my wife of 31 years had just asked me to eat upstairs like a child being kept away from company. "Pardon me," I said, "my mother is still upset about what happened at Thanksgiving. You know how she gets. I just don't want any tension at the table." I stood there for a moment. I remember the hum of the refrigerator. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the window above the sink and made everything look warmer than it was. What tension did I cause at Thanksgiving, I asked. I carved the turkey, I washed every dish, I didn't say a single word to your mother that wasn't perfectly polite. "You know what you did," she said, and walked into the other room. I didn't know what I did. I still don't. That was the thing about 31 years with this woman. I had spent so much of it trying to understand what I had done wrong in any given moment that I'd stopped keeping track. At some point, it had become background noise. Her mother had never liked me. Not when we met, not at our wedding, not when our daughter was born, not ever. I was a retired civil engineer from Sudbury, the son of a Ukrainian immigrant who'd worked the mines, and apparently that had never been quite good enough for a family that considered themselves a cut above because they'd once owned a hardware business in Oakville. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the backyard. The maple tree I'd planted when our daughter was 7 was enormous now. It had survived ice storms and droughts and 31 winters. It had outlasted things I'd thought were permanent. I could hear them arriving. Car doors. My wife's voice going bright and warm in a way it hadn't been with me in years. Her mother's laugh. That particular laugh she had, sharp and performative. I heard my daughter's name and realized my own daughter was down there, and she hadn't called to tell me she was coming, hadn't come upstairs to say hello. I ate a bowl of leftover lentil soup at the small desk in our bedroom. Alone. At 63 years old. I am not a man who cries easily. I went 30 years without crying at anything, but something happened to me that evening, sitting there with my soup going cold and the sound of family laughter coming up through the floor, that I can only describe as something quietly breaking. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a small, clean fracture in something I had believed in for a very long time. The next morning I woke early, as I always do, and came downstairs to make coffee. My wife was already at the kitchen table scrolling through her tablet. She looked rested. She didn't apologize. She asked if I wanted eggs. I said no. I poured my coffee and sat across from her and said very calmly, "I'd like to talk about what happened yesterday." "There's nothing to talk about," she said. "It went perfectly. Everyone had a lovely time. I sat upstairs alone for 4 hours. You chose to do that. I set my mug down. You told me to stay upstairs. I said it would be better. I didn't lock you in a room." She turned back to her tablet. "You always make everything into a bigger thing than it is." I took my coffee outside onto the back deck and stood in the November cold for a long time. The maple tree had lost most of its leaves. They were in a pile against the fence that I hadn't gotten around to bagging yet. I remember thinking I should do that before the first real snow. I also remember thinking that something had shifted, not just the night before, something longer and slower that had been shifting for years, and I hadn't let myself look at it directly until right now. I went back inside. I went to my home office. I opened the filing cabinet where I keep copies of everything: mortgage documents, tax returns, insurance policies, account statements. I pulled out the last 12 months of our joint account statements, the ones I received by mail, because I am the kind of man who still prefers paper. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I think I just needed something to do with my hands, something that felt like solid ground. I sat with those statements for 2 hours. By the time I was done, I had a yellow legal pad with 3 pages of notes, and a very uncomfortable feeling in my chest. The transfers had started small, $200 here, $300 here, all moving into an account number I didn't recognize, with a routing description I'd never set up. Over 12 months, looking at what I could trace, it came to just under $41,000. The transfers were timed carefully, never on the same day of the month, twice in a row, never large enough individually to trigger an automatic fraud alert, always on weekdays when I was out of the house. I am a man who spent 38 years calculating load-bearing tolerances and project budgets. I know when numbers don't add up. I didn't confront her. I want to be clear about that, because I know some people will ask why. I didn't confront her because I'd been a structural engineer long enough to know that you don't touch the wall until you understand what's behind it. You take measurements, you get a second opinion. You make sure you know exactly what you're dealing with before you do anything that can't be undone. I called my son the next morning. He lives in Halifax now, works in marine biology, which is about as far from my life as you can get, but he got my practical nature and my mother's calm. I trust him completely. I told him I needed to talk, and I drove to the Tim Hortons on LaSalle and sat in a corner booth and told him everything on the phone. He was quiet for a long time after. "Dad," he said, "you need to call a lawyer before you do anything else." "I know," I said. "Not tomorrow, today." I called a family law firm in Sudbury that afternoon. The lawyer I spoke to, a very direct woman in her late 40s, asked me to come in the following Tuesday and bring every financial document I could find. She told me to make copies of everything before I came and to keep the copies somewhere outside the house. She also told me, and I wrote this down because it surprised me, that what I was describing, unauthorized transfers from a joint account to an undisclosed personal account, could potentially constitute financial abuse under Canadian law, and depending on the details, might involve the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. I drove home. I made dinner. I asked my wife how her day was. She told me about a podcast she'd been listening to. We watched the news. We went to bed on our respective sides of a king-size mattress that had never felt so wide. I slept better than I had in months. Over the next week, I made copies of everything. I drove to a FedEx office on a Tuesday afternoon and scanned over 200 pages of documents. I bought a small locked box from Canadian Tire and kept it in the trunk of my car. I opened a new individual account at a different branch of my bank on the other side of town and began setting up my direct deposit for my pension to go there instead. I also hired a second accountant independently, separately from the one we'd used together for years, to look at the statements and give me a professional assessment. He called me 4 days later. His voice was very careful, very measured. He said the pattern he was seeing was consistent with deliberate, sustained financial concealment. He asked if I wanted him to prepare a formal report. I said yes. I said nothing at home. I made coffee every morning. I raked the leaves. I watched the hockey game on Thursday nights. I was, by all appearances, exactly the same man I had been for 31 years. She didn't notice. That told me something too. It was on a Saturday morning, 9 days after I'd first sat down with those bank statements, when I walked into the kitchen and found her on the phone, speaking in a low voice. She saw me and turned toward the window. I poured my coffee. I could hear enough, her mother's voice on the other end, tinny and urgent, something about the timeline, and before he figures it out. My wife looked over her shoulder and saw me standing there. She ended the call. "Who was that?" I asked. "My mother. Just chatting." I nodded. I drank my coffee. I looked out the window at the maple tree. 3 days later, I moved into the spare room. I told her it was because of my back. I'd been having some trouble sleeping and I didn't want to disturb her. She accepted that easily, which again told me something. I met with my lawyer on the following Tuesday. I brought the documents. She went through everything carefully and methodically. She explained my options. She explained what joint property meant in Ontario, what pension sharing meant, what the process would look like. She also told me that given the documented transfers, she would be recommending we file a complaint with the bank's fraud department and loop in a forensic accountant. I asked her what she thought I should do. She said, "You've already started doing it." I filed for divorce on a Thursday. It was a grey November morning. and I drove myself to the lawyer's office alone. On the way back, I stopped at a small Ukrainian restaurant on Elm Street that my father used to love, the one that's been there since the 80s and still makes borscht the way it should be made. I had a bowl by myself at a table by the window. I watched people walking past on the street, bundled against the cold, going wherever they were going. I felt for the first time in a very long time like the floor beneath me was solid. My wife found out about the filing on a Friday afternoon. I was at my son's hockey friend's place. No, that's not right. I was at my neighbour's garage, the one who'd been helping me restore an old canoe we planned to take out next summer. My phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then rang. I let it ring. It rang 4 more times on the drive home. When I pulled into the driveway and walked through the back door, she was standing in the kitchen. Her face was a colour I had never seen on her before. "You filed for divorce," she said. "Yes," without saying anything to me. "I said quite a lot to you over quite a few years," I said. I don't think the problem was a shortage of words. "My mother," she started. "This has nothing to do with your mother," I said. "Actually, that's not true. It has something to do with your mother, but it has more to do with $41,000. The colour changed on her face again. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Her voice had gone very flat. "I know you don't want to know what I'm talking about," I said. "That's different." I went upstairs. I had already arranged, very quietly, over the previous week, to have my important belongings moved to my son's storage unit in the East End. The things that mattered to me, my father's watch, my mother's recipe box, the photograph albums from when the kids were young, my engineering certificates, my files, were already gone. What remained in the bedroom was furniture and the ordinary accumulation of a life that had stopped fitting me some time ago. I came back downstairs with my coat and my overnight bag. I had a reservation at the Holiday Inn on Regent for the next 2 weeks while things got sorted. "You can't just leave," she said. "I have a lawyer," I said. "You should get one too." I opened the back door. The cold came in. The maple tree in the backyard was bare now, all its branches dark against the pale November sky, and it was still standing. I walked to my car. She called twice more that evening and once the next morning. I let all 3 calls go to voicemail. My lawyer had advised me to let all communication go through her office for the time being, and for once in my life I was very good at following instructions. My son called that Saturday afternoon. He asked how I was doing. "Better," I said, and I meant it. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something good, but from finally admitting that it had already been gone for a long time. I grieved that. I am still grieving it, in the quiet way that men my age grieve things. Slowly, privately, while making coffee in the morning and standing in the cold and watching bare trees hold their shape against the sky. But I did not grieve the decision, not for a single day. My lawyer called the following Monday. The bank had confirmed the transfers and opened an internal investigation. The forensic accountant's report was complete. The numbers were clear. The record was clear. Everything I needed was already documented, organised and filed, because I had been a structural engineer for 38 years, and if I know one thing, it is how to read what's holding something up and what's quietly making it fall. The house sold in the spring. The settlement took longer than I would have liked, but less time than I had feared. I did not fight over the small things. I am not interested in small things anymore. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment now, on the 4th floor of a building on the south end of the city. I can see the lake from my kitchen window on clear days. My son came up from Halifax in July, and we finished restoring that canoe. We took it out on Ramsey Lake on a Tuesday morning when the water was calm and the light was doing that thing it does up here in the summer, going gold and flat across the surface, and we didn't talk much, we just paddled. That was enough. Some nights I sit by the window with my tea and think about 31 years, about what was real and what I had convinced myself was real, about the difference between those two things and how long it can take to see it. My daughter called in September. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known everything that was happening and that she wished she'd come upstairs that night to see me. I told her it was all right. I told her the maple tree was still there. I'd ask the new owners to keep it. There is something I have come to understand, slowly and without much fanfare, about the way certain things in a life unravel. It is rarely loud, it rarely announces itself. It moves the way water moves under ice, quiet, patient, finding every small weakness until one day the surface gives way and you realize the damage was never sudden at all. I think about the moment I sat down with those bank statements at my desk. 38 years as an engineer had given me one reliable habit. When something doesn't add up, you don't guess, and you don't panic. You measure, you document, you take your time and let the numbers tell you what they know. That discipline, the refusal to act before I understood what I was actually dealing with, is what made the difference. Not anger, not pride. Just the quiet, steady work of a man who had learned that solid ground is built, not assumed. What my wife did was wrong. I have no complicated feelings about that. Moving money out of a joint account over the course of a year in careful increments, timed so no alert would fire. That is not a mistake or a misunderstanding. That is a choice made repeatedly in the dark by someone who believed I would not look closely enough to notice. The consequences that followed were not punishment I arranged. They were simply the natural result of actions that had been set in motion long before I opened that filing cabinet. You build something dishonest, and eventually the structure fails. That is not philosophy. That is just physics. What I am more interested in, looking back, is the question of what I did right. Not in some self-congratulatory sense, but honestly. I did not confront her in anger. I did not make threats I couldn't follow through on. I did not let my hurt turn into something ugly that I would later have to answer for. I gathered information. I called my son. I found a lawyer. I moved carefully through something that could have made me reckless, and I stayed recognizably myself throughout. That steadiness, that refusal to become someone smaller under pressure, is the thing I am most grateful for even now. My daughter called in September and apologized. She said she hadn't known everything. I believed her. Choosing to believe her took something. It would have been easier in some ways to hold it all at arm's length, but I have learned at 63 that the people worth keeping in your life are worth the small risk of being wrong about them. That is what I told myself when I said it was all right, and it was. The canoe is in my storage locker now, waiting for spring. My son and I made plans to take it back out to Ramsey Lake in June, maybe push further north if the weather holds. I think about that more than I think about the divorce. I think about the water and the light and the particular silence of being somewhere that asks nothing of you. That is where I am headed, not toward anything dramatic, just toward a life that is honest all the way through. That turns out to be enough.